So there are times that you want esters, there are times you don't. There are times you want phenols, there are times you don't. So this is my little talk on esters and phenols, what they are, where do they come, what are they, where do they come from, and how do we control them? Okay, so in very fancy talk, what are they? An ester is an organic compound in which the hydrogen in one of the compounds carboxyl, I'm going to butcher these, I am not a student of chemistry, carboxyl groups is replaced by another hydrocarbon. So for example, this is down here and the bottom left is the, sorry, my thing is in the way and I can't, oh crap. There we go, very professional. This is isoamyl acetate, which most of us know as kind of a pear flavor, or more distinctly the banana flavor out of like a German Weissbier or a Hefeweizen. And a phenol is an organic compound in which the hydroxyl group is bonded to an aromatic hydrogen carbon ring, also called a benzene ring. And so then in the bottom right there is 4-vinyl guaiacol, which is another flavor that we find a lot in German wheat beers, which is kind of the clove taste. Okay, so but what really are they for those of us who are not chemistry nerds? Broadly speaking, esters are fruity and frequently desirable, while phenols are spicy and are usually unwelcome. Now, as with most things in brewing, it is important to remember that there are no absolutes. There are certain styles where esters are way, way out of style, and there are certain styles where if you don't have phenols, you did it wrong. So some of the typical flavors that you would find from esters would be anise, apple, banana, honey, juicy fruit gum, nail polish remover, pear, pineapple, or strawberry. And what's really interesting to me is I kept seeing a bunch of references to not pear, but pear drop, which I had to Google because I had never heard of a pear drop. And apparently it's a type of candy that's popular in the UK, which sort of tastes like what I would imagine be like a pear flavored Jelly Belly. Another thing I thought that was really interesting here was that they listed anise as this, because in my mind, anise is a spice. And so that would be kind of, anise is like a black licorice spice flavor. And then some examples of phenolic flavors or phenol flavors are cloves, medicine, especially sore throat spray, pepper, adhesive bandage, smoke, sweaty horse blankets, tannins, and vanilla. So one thing that I really learned from this is not all esters are good. So here are some fun things. I didn't realize that butyric acid is actually an ester. And for those of you who don't know, butyric acid is the major aromatic compound in vomit. If you've ever had a beer that has butyric acid or has been spiked with butyric, you will know that this is not a good ester. There's also ethyl acetate, which tastes like nail polish remover. Kind of just generally in high concentration, esters can acquire a heavy, undesirable solvent-like character. So even if it's a beer that you want esters, if there's too many of them, it's not going to be good. And the biggest lesson here is just know the style that you're brewing and whether or not esters are appropriate and at what levels. For example, you're almost never going to want an ester in a lager. That's just not nice, clean lager fermentation character. And you don't want a whole bunch of them in, say, an American Pale Ale, but an English IPA, they're appropriate. And you definitely want them in some of the German styles and the Belgian styles. So here's a table of all of these kind of potential different ester flavors. And then, so up at the top, you can see the name and then some of the descriptions in case you just off the top of your head don't know what ethyl hexanoate tastes like, which is apparently apple-like with some anise seed. And then troubleshooting estery and alcoholic flavors in beer. So you can kind of see, really the suggestion is if it's overly estery, change your yeast strain. So then the flip side to that is not all phenols are bad. So most of these aren't phenols that you would find in beer, but I thought it was really interesting that it's a big category that gives us so many flavors. Like capsaicin is a phenol that you'll know from chilies. Two that we do see in brewing are eugenol, which is the clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, vanilla, and guaiacol, which is smoky. And something that was interesting to me is the smoked character that comes from smoked malts like Rauch malt and peat malt are actually phenols that give kind of smoked beers that really classic flavor that you want. But that's not necessarily something you don't, there are not a lot of beers that you want to taste like a campfire. So what causes esters? One sec. So esters are formed when an alcohol and organic acids in the wort react in a process called esterification. How clever. So really, this is caused when the acids that are in your wort anyway interact with the alcohol that is starting to build up through the process of fermentation. And then there are these kind of four things that can really impact the amount of esters. First of all is fermentation temperature. The warmer you ferment something, the more esters you're going to get. And I know that there's back and forth about warm fermenting lagers, and you're still getting the clean characteristic. And I'm sure that some of that has to just do with that particular lager yeast strain. But as a rule of thumb, if you took 2 batches of beer made with the same yeast and you fermented them at different temperatures, the one that you fermented warmer would end up having more esters. Whether or not it's perceptible, they would still be there. Another thing that causes esters is your wort composition. So if you have higher levels of sugar or zinc in the wort, that can cause ester levels to build up. So higher alcohol or higher gravity beers are more likely to develop esters, which makes sense because you're going to end up with more alcohol that can interact with the acids in the wort. And then more dissolved oxygen or lipids can reduce the amount of esters. So if you're finding that your wort or your beer comes out overly estery, kind of no matter what you do, it might be a good idea to check cold side oxidation, like how much if you're adding oxygen or if you're getting enough oxygen into your wort before you start fermentation. The yeast strain, this is kind of the most obvious one. Some strains are more prone to creating esters. For example, a Bavarian wheat yeast, that's really its primary, like kind of defining characteristic, is that it readily creates isoamyl acetate, which is the main volatile aroma of banana and jackfruit. I didn't know the jackfruit part. And volatile, when they're talking about aroma, that's what makes aromas work, is that they are dissolving or dissipating from the liquid, and that's where you get aromas from. And then the last thing that can cause esters is the environment. So a tall, narrow fermenter is less likely to create esters than a shallow. I think I might have that backwards. I should probably check that. Anyway, because the tall, narrow fermenters create higher hydrostatic pressure and CO2 levels in narrow containers. So hydrostatic pressure is just the amount of pressure that liquid exerts upon itself when it's in higher volumes. So if you think about, like, as you swim down, there's greater pressure around you. It's just the weight of the liquid. So what causes phenols? Kind of the most common cause of phenols is actually water. So, and there's kind of 2 ways that your water can impact phenol production. The first is it can come from poorly cleaned or stored equipment or an insufficient boil. So the poorly cleaned or stored equipment is really if you use a cleaning product like bleach that contains chlorine. You can still do that, but be sure that you rinse it really, really well, and that you rinse it with water that doesn't have, chlorine in it. So chlorine and bromine in the water can give an antiseptic medicinal flavor or aroma. And chlorine combines with phenols to create chlorophenols, which taste like Band-Aid. So it's important, if you're using tap water, make sure that you're getting the chlorine out of there. Have a sufficient boil. Make sure all your stuff is clean if you're going to use bleach. That's, I know, part of the reason why Star San is really highly recommended, because it doesn't have chlorine in it, so you don't have to be as careful about that coming into contact with your beer. Hops and malts can cause phenols. Hops and malts contain tannins, especially darker malts, and tannins are also known as polyphenols. And so tannin extraction, particularly from your malts, happens at higher rates when you sparge at too high of a temperature, or if you're going to mash, if you're going to be crazy and try and mash really high, or if you are sparging and your runoff drops below about 1010 specific gravity. So letting, for those of you who are fly spargers or batch spargers or whatever, like me, keep an eye on your runoff. If you're having trouble with kind of phenolic or tannin-y bitter. And then yeast and bacteria can cause phenols. So again, everyone's favorite example of phenols. Bavarian Weissbier or Hefeweizen derives its signature clove character from 4-vinyl guaiacol. And then Brettanomyces-driven styles are often described as horsey or barnyard-like, thanks to 4-ethylphenol. And then here are all the places I stole this information from, because I did not come up with all of it. And there's tons and tons and tons of information out there. Some of it is like way over my head, especially this first one, the esters and phenols in beer from the Mr. Beer Pod. That's pretty technical if you're really into the science part of things. And that's it.
Nice, Beth. That was rad.